the more I dwell on this periodically, the more I get to evolve my guess estimate of what these things are. And guess estimating that there was something more to the Hutchison effect, well, might be true, might be valid. But thinking that it's a carrier wave that was missing from the definition may be not a requirement. The requirement of modification might simply be that radio interference is not what I thought it was. It's not interference between two or more transverse waves. It's interference between the electrostatic field and, at minimum, one transverse electromagnetic wave. In other words, everything has its own resonance in which consonance occurs, but it also has its point of dissonance. So actually there are multiple types of resonances, but when we're looking at over unity, obviously we want consonance. We want something that builds in the right places, in the right way. So what I'm thinking is that an electrostatic field is a compression field. It has its own internal characteristic signature of resonance, and if a radio wave, an electromagnetic wave, in other words, seeks to pass through a field of electrostatics, it will go through faster than the speed of light if it resonates with the electrostatic field, but it will be impeded against going through and go slower than the speed of light if it does not, if it fails to resonate with the electrostatic field resonance interference. So that's the interference, not between two or more radio interference waves, transverse electromagnetic, but just one, and the electrostatic field itself. So this opens up a whole different possibility because it brings up Jim Murray and John Newman, because they were saying the definition of a resistor is merely the conversion of energy, electrical, let's say, into heat or light or both. But it doesn't slow down the speed. So what John Newman and Jim Murray did in SERPs and John Newman did in his motor, while he lengthened the wire so that the speed of light rate at which the electricity travels along the coil is effectively resisted in the sense that it's resisted by the restriction of the speed of light itself, coupled with the distance it has to travel along the entire length of that coil of wire. 55 miles, doesn't reach it before it switches polarity, because it's an AC configured system, and so, it never reaches the end, and so it accumulates in the coil itself. That means you don't send the energy back to the source and kill the dipole. And that's where the Tom comes from, Tom Bearden. I was wondering about that. Oh, Tom, that sounds pretty cool, don't kill the dipole. The source only provides the voltage dipole at the two terminals of your source, and if it's DC, let's say, and it does not provide the current. The current comes from the ether, comes into the circuit, and kills the dipole. So, if you're disallowing current to reach the other end, the target end of the dipole source, in other words, if you prevent it from going back to the source, and instead let it allow it or encourage it to build up within the circuit, then you're effectively giving yourself the opportunity to recycle the energy and, most importantly, not kill the dipole. So, if this is the correct way to interpret what does the Hutchison effect constitute, then, in a sense, John Newman is satisfying that criteria because it's the length of the wire that constitutes the electrostatic field equivalent in his mock-up version of the Hutchison effect. And that's interfering with the electricity reaching the other end before he switches polarity. So effectively, it's the Hutchison effect without maybe necessarily specifically being the Hutchison effect, because he doesn't make use of an electrostatic field. Yet, the wire itself is a field of compression, organization. And is compression because it's solid. It's not a liquid, and it's not a gas, and it's not a plasma. So it is compression. It's just a material compression. So, in more ways than one, the Hutchison effect is being satisfied by the John Newman device. It's just not apparent at first glance. But upon analysis, not only do I get a better, more clear definition of what the Hutchison effect actually means, but how it applies to the John Newman motor, and how is Tom Bearden's goal satisfied? Don't kill the dipole. you know what that sounds like? Don't kill the postman. Don't hate the postman just because he brings you mail that you don't like. Karma, in other words. Don't whoever brings your karma. That's what it sounds like to me. So this simplifies everything, but also makes it more broad, and it helps. What? Give a little more credence to my definition of longitudinal and transverse, is that longitudinal is a shock wave traveling through a compression field, and it's voltage oriented without any current, while a transverse wave is kinetic energy, what we call kinetic energy, traveling through a non-compression field, which creates a domino effect, which is not possible when you're dealing with a compression field. A compression field is more closely associated with the analogy that Eric Dollard and the other fellow, I forget his name, in the old 1980s video where they're grabbing two ends of a stick. No, actually, I thought they should have used a stick. But they just pull on the rope and make it solid. And so instead of flicking it to make a wave go across, which is a transverse wave, instead they pull each other on each other's end to make the rope taut. And then Eric tries pulling, and when the other fellow gives a little to allow Eric to draw the rope towards himself, we see it as a solid, like a rod, But it is good to use the rope because it's changeable, it's convertible. It's possible to convert a transverse wave into a longitudinal wave, or a longitudinal wave into a transverse wave, according to my way of interpreting the situation, because all you do is manipulate the field, which will dictate how the wave behaves. Is it a longitudinal behavior or a transverse behavior, based on whether it's a compression field it's having to pass through, or a non-compression field, a domino field, basically. But regardless, either a domino or a longitudinal field both have their own respective consonant resonances and dissonant resonances. In other words, their way of amplifying or to a zenith or suppressing to a nadir energy wanting to pass through them. They offer resistance, or slowing down the speed of light, or they speed it up. And, the rate of speed up wasn't like thousands of millions of times. We may get an over-unity device that does that, but that's because it's accumulating energy and recycling it. Still drawing from the source, but not sending it back, and thus not killing the dipole. So the battery, let's say it's a DC battery source, lasts a lot longer because it's not being killed. Because the energy is not being sent back as quickly as it's being drawn off. That's quite a trick. Anywho. So that's my best guess, though, of what a Hutchison effect constitutes. How do you create a circuit that somehow uses the atomic element properties of copper, aluminum, and iron to thus try to hypothetically replicate Tesla's special generator? I don't know yet still. But it's intriguing because now we've got principles to use, principles of operation. I mean, copper, aluminum, and iron doesn't tell us much. William Lyne quoted Mr. Dort, iron is the magnetic and copper is the active and aluminum is the reflective, but that doesn't help. Except that aluminum being reflective is used like in dishes, satellite dishes, and when you think about it, when you want to bounce off a transverse wave off of something, and you use a shiny aluminum surface, an aluminum dish, satellite dish, isn't that dish functioning as a compression wave? As a compression field, as a compression field, such that you want maximum resistance to deflect the beam that's coming from the emitter back out into space. And of course you want a smooth surface, which means you want maximum compression. That's what it amounts to, right? Maximum compression. So that the transverse waves being sent at the surface of the satellite dish do not interact except by way of reflection. So aluminum is satisfying the characteristic of an electrostatic field, which would lend the notion that that's what you use to create it, to enhance the properties of the presence of the aluminum, and thus kind of recycle the aluminum so that you don't have to use so much mass. Now, when Tesla said use 200 pounds of iron to increase your horsepower, that doesn't mean you have to add 200 pounds of iron. You just have to effectively add the equivalent of what would amount to being 200 pounds of iron. And if the iron is magnetized in a very peculiar way, then that could be the equivalent of 200 pounds of the mass of iron added to the circuit. So there are ways of looking at this to try to make it more efficient. How else would my friend's coworker have a notebook-size shaped replication of Tesla's trimetal generator if there wasn't some kind of enhancements going on? So we have to think that way. How do we substitute for mass? Or how do we substitute for an electrostatic field? So it's going to take a certain amount of dexterity, obviously, but some kind of thinking along the lines of what little William Dort provided to, Mr. Dort Jr. provided to William Line. We're going to have to add to it, obviously. We're going to have to try to work our way through this. But this is what I've got so far. Again, just broad hypothesizing, nothing really that specific. Because if I do come up with anything specific, I end up changing my mind because I really don't know what I'm talking about. Haven't noticed, have you? Or you have noticed. But it is helping me massage the hypothesis, the hypothetical theory, to try to come up with a more clearer picture. And so my idea of what radio interference meant within an electrostatic field as a definition of the Hutchison effect obviously was off base entirely. Because I already knew how to properly interpret that expression. Yet I forgot all the hours and weeks and days that I spent working on Stanley Meyer playlist on my Vinyasa channel, trying to grope with the simple little statement that Peter Lindemann told somebody at that 2013 conference break. And I didn't have the memory, the recall of my basic college chemistry to understand what Peter had said. The other guy got it. I didn't. And it took me at least a year, if not two, to get it. So now I'm having the same problem with the Hutchison effect. I didn't get it. Even though I thought I was quoting it verbatim, I didn't understand the words, the relationships between the words, and consequently what's required of somebody to manifest the Hutchison effect in some real world situation. And so it's very useful to look at, well, what's the definition of resistance? It's merely conversion. I wouldn't call it a resistance. We have the wrong words. We should be calling it a converter, because it's not resisting anything. It's not sending it back, and it's not slowing it down. Good grief. And a coil of wire is a resistor, but it's not all coming out as heat. Some of it is, but some of it's coming out as a magnetic field. So, it's a converter. It's not a resistor. Ohms is not resistance. Ohms is conversion, but doesn't tell you what it's being converted to, necessarily. How swell. So you could say it's 50 ohms of resistance, but then you haven't qualified it. How many caloric conversion of heat is it doing versus, inclusive or, not exclusive or, but inclusive or, how much millihenries, or henries for that matter, of magnetic field is it creating versus the heat that it's creating. But the resistance merely means it's converting the energy. The rest it's sending through. But the balance offered to the resistance is being converted into something else. Now, in a book I read a long time back in the 80s, that was written back in the 30s and published by the Lemurian Fellowship Foundation Press down here in Ramona, California. Ooh, I just gave away where I live. It said that energy comes on different planes of existence, and it's stepped down until finally it reaches physical manifestation. So it's more like a step-down transformer. It's stepping it down until it finally reaches the gross level. So all those very highfalutin moral concepts that we reserve for the soul and the higher mind and the guardian angel, that's energy. It just hasn't manifested yet on the physical plane. And so a step-down transformer is the perfect analogy that the author of that, or the authors of that book, were using to qualify how creation operates on its many planes of existence. So here, a resistor is doing the same thing. It's acting kind of similar to a step-down transformer, but it's a DC situation, and it's not changing voltage versus amperage. It's changing whether you're going to have any amperage to begin with. At the other end. So it's converting the amperage, actually. So, what is an AC transformer doing? Is it merely converting the voltage and the amperage is a side effect? Or is it converting both in an inverse manner? That doesn't make any sense. When you're doing a conversion, unless they're at right angles to each other. Holy shit. That's right, the electric field and the magnetic field. I always like to think that the magnetic field is a voltage-oriented phenomenon and that the electric field is an amperage-oriented phenomenon. And in an AC situation, it's very poignant because it's a switching field in which it's constantly, it's not reversing direction, it's reversing which wire it's traveling on. So the electricity, there's one electricity going one way and another electricity coming back, but you switch back and forth which wires it travels on. So there's no change in inertia. It's just, well, there is. The wire suffers change of inertia. That's why you have a voltage spike at the beginning of each half phase, or each half cycle of the AC cycle, each half phase of the AC cycle. Anywho, I better not go too far with this. I better just stick with what I started with. Yeah, if I go too far afield, I go, woo! Okay, time to shut up.